All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at an example problem here. Very similar to what you would find on the AP test or on my tests. All right, so we're given a required reserve ratio of 20%, and we're going to assume that the Federal Reserve purchases $100 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities. So the U.S. Treasury security would be Treasury bond, Treasury bill. It's basically government debt. It's issued by the United States. It's bought and sold on the market, including by the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is purchasing $100 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities on the open market from a primary security dealer. And we're going to determine the amount that a single bank can lend from this Federal Reserve purchase of bonds. So this is basically, if you're looking at the amount that a single bank can lend from this Federal Reserve purchase of bonds, this is excess reserves. This is the amount that this initial bank can go ahead and lend out. So this new amount of demand deposits minus the required reserves is going to be equal to the initial change in excess reserves, which is the amount of money that this bank can lend out. Now, if you look at the amount of new demand deposits, the Federal Reserve is purchasing $100 million worth of Treasury securities. So that's the amount of new demand deposits. And then they have to go ahead and hold 20% of that. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So you have $100 million is your amount of new demand deposits taken from the problem. You're going to subtract 20% of $100 million. So that $100 million is the amount of new demand deposits, the amount of money being put into the system. This bank has to hold 20% of it. So 20% times $100 million. So you have $100 million minus $20 million, so you have $80 million worth of excess reserves. So this bank has $20 million of required reserves. That's how much they have to hold. They have to hold 20% of that $100 million. But then if you take that total reserves minus the required reserves, you get $80 million in excess reserves. And that's the amount that this single bank can go ahead and lend out. Now let's take a look at the second part of the problem. And this first part that is not highlighted that's not italicized, is going to be the same. And then the second part that is italicized is different. So we're given a required reserve ratio of 20%. We're assuming the Federal Reserve purchases $100 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities on the open market from a primary security dealer. We're going to determine the total change in loans in the banking system from this Federal Reserve purchase of bonds. So we're going to take a look at the maximum. We want to find out the maximum change in loans. What is our maximum expansion of money, the money supply? Because remember, it's this change in loans that helps expand the money supply. So the equation we're going to use for this is this. The initial change in excess reserves times the money multiplier. Now the initial change in excess reserves is just excess reserves. So that can be written in an equation form, ER times 1 over RRR, because 1 over RRR is the money multiplier. The initial change in excess reserves is ER. So if you have ER times 1 over RRR, that's going to be the maximum change in loans. So we know that our excess reserves from the previous problem was $80 million. So we can throw that in place of our excess reserves, and we're multiplying that by 1 over the reserve requirement ratio. The reserve requirement ratio we already saw was 20%. Or you could also, if you put that in decimal form, it would be 0.20. So 80 million times 1 over 0.20. So you get 80 million times 5, which is $400 million max in new loans. It's important to note, ladies and gentlemen, that if banks don't lend or people don't borrow, you will not get this maximum change in the money supply in loans. It is important that banks lend out all of their excess reserves. It is important that people go ahead and borrow and then redeposit in order to achieve that maximum change in new loans. If that does not happen, then you don't see that maximum change in new loans or max change in the money supply, which we'll be looking at next. So let's go ahead and take a look at that next problem here. So given a required reserve ratio of 20%, we're going to assume the Federal Reserve purchases $100 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities on the open market from a primary security dealer. That part is the same. The second part is different. So determine the maximum total change in the money supply. This is the total amount of checkable deposit creation from this Federal Reserve purchase of bonds. So we're going to look at the new money supply total, the new amount of checkable deposit creation that came from this initial purchase of U.S. Treasury securities. So there's a couple ways you can do this problem. The first way is if you take the maximum change in loans plus the amount of the Federal Reserve action, you'll get your new money supply total here. So we already found out from the last problem you had $400 million worth of loans being created, plus the initial deposit by the Federal Reserve was $100 million. So 400 plus $100 million, you have $500 million maximum change in the money supply or checkable deposit creation. So the way to think about this is the Federal Reserve purchased $100 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities. Okay, so that initial $100 million created a maximum change in loans. And that grand total of the maximum change in loans was $400 million. So if you take that maximum change in loans and then you throw in the initial amount that the Federal Reserve action spent, you'll get your max total change in the money supply. So basically, the max change in loans is showing you how much that money supply grew after the $100 million. So it grew by $400 million, plus you got to throw in the $100 million itself, and then you have a new grand total of $500 million max change in the money supply. Another way you can look at this is you can use the equation total reserves times 1 over the reserve requirement ratio. That's another equation that will actually work. So our total reserves was the amount put into the system, and $100 million worth of Treasury securities was put into the system. So you have $100 million times 1 over the reserve requirement ratio. That's 1 over 0.20, which is 5. So 100 million times 5, you get a $500 million max change in the money supply, or maximum change or maximum checkable deposit creation. And remember, if banks do not lend, people don't borrow and redeposit, then you are not going to go ahead and achieve those that maximum change in the money supply. So let's go ahead and hit a quick review here. So remember, the required reserve is equal to the amount of the deposit the amount of the deposit times the required reserve ratio. Excess reserves is equal to total reserves minus required reserves. It's important to have that equation memorized. The maximum amount a single bank can lend is the change in excess reserves from that deposit. The money multiplier is equal to 1 over the required reserve ratio. The total change in loans is equal to the amount a single bank can lend times the money multiplier. It's that change in loans that expands the money supply. And the total change in the money supply is equal to the total change in loans plus the dollar amount of the Fed action. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of problems here. So here's the 2 problems I'm going to have you do. For number 1, we're going to go ahead and we're given a required reserve ratio of 10%. Assume the Federal Reserve purchases $200 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities on the open market from a primary securities dealer. We're going to determine the maximum total change in loans in the banking system from this Federal Reserve purchase of bonds. So it's important to note, ladies and gentlemen, that to calculate the total change in loans, the first thing you need to find out is what your excess reserves are. So the first step to this is going to be calculating what your excess reserves are from this transaction, and then you're going to go ahead and calculate that maximum total change in loans. And you can look back at the example problem to help you with that. For number 2, you're given a required reserve ratio of 10%. We're assuming the Federal Reserve purchases $200 million worth of U.S. Treasury securities on the open market from a primary securities dealer. We're going to determine the maximum total change in the money supply from this Federal Reserve purchase of bonds. So once you figure out the maximum total change in loans, you should be able to pretty easily figure out the maximum change in the money supply. So once again, this is going to be very similar to the problems that you just answered, or the example that you were just given. Okay, so go ahead and answer those. I'll check and make sure that you answered those tomorrow. I'm also going to have you go ahead and do your summary in a paragraph, describe what you learned today. And I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.